My name is Sandra Yellowhorse. I am from the Dene Nation. I was born and raised in Gallup, New Mexico, and my daughter attended a specialized school in Rio Rancho, and I attended the University in New Mexico. And so that's where I am now. My daughter was diagnosed with autism when she was 3 years, 3 months old. I always say that her autism doesn't define who she is. She's a beautiful Kia'ani child. That's our clan, our Navajo clan. And she has so many strengths and talents and interests that she cultivates in her life. And so when I start thinking about education for children with varying differences and abilities, I think about focusing on the strengths that they have, because so much of our education and the way we even think about disability, we think about it from a deficit model. So she really taught me so many things about myself, and it's been quite a journey with her as well. She's 9 years old. She's an expert at playing Nintendo. She knows all of the characters, all the episodes and series. She's just very talented, and she loves to sing and dance, and she's my life's joy. I'm a historian, so I do look back at the way that disability or kind of normative politics shape what we currently think about today in terms of ability or gender or a variety of other things. So I think because of the way Native nations have been impacted through history, through our treaties, through boarding school, through all these different events, that we do have certain ways of thinking about disability. Now, when I talk to other people in the community sometimes, I have heard traditional stories about varying abilities, and there's stories of accountability, stories of resilience, stories that value inherent diversity, because we see diversity everywhere in nature and the natural world. And that really was how Indigenous education was conceptualized for a very long time before we had Western education and Western ways of knowing. And so I do look at those potential ways to transform how we see our children, how we see our accountability to people with various differences. And so I think right now, because we're so deeply impacted by things that have happened in our history, that maybe we do have conceptions that are compounded by racism, by intergenerational trauma, that impact how we think about disability from a deficit model. But that's not to say that Indigenous people can't recall from their traditional stories or cosmologies our traditional ways of thinking about difference. And I think that's a really hopeful way to think about things, and it's really beautiful and restorative. And I think that when we think about disparities and certain challenges on the reservation, in rural areas, I don't want to say the reservation, but in rural areas, maybe in border towns where there aren't a lot of services or organizations that provide awareness, I think this conference it does a couple things. First, it gives people a platform to share our shared histories of colonialism, and also to really think about just having solidarity with one another. I think Native people often recognize each other as family, as related, as having shared histories and shared values and different ways of seeing things. And so I think, and I've noticed that with a lot of families, they like that familiarity and they like that support. I also think this conference does something to show educators and planners, this is how we conceptualize and think about our children and how we think about their differences, and what we want as a community that's culturally responsive, strength-based, and community-centered. There's so much about disability law and politics that always focuses on the individual. We want independent living. We want all of these, this whole idea of thinking about a person only by themselves. I think Native people have a very complex way of understanding one another, where we see each other as a community. And that's why when there's a disparity, it's not just an isolated issue where it just impacts one person. It impacts all of us. Our care for our most vulnerable people in our society aren't just a private family matter that's taken care of. It's the responsibility of the entire community. And so I think that, speaking with educators and planners and really showing them, like, this is how we conceptualize belonging and inclusion. It's predicated on our kinship systems. It's predicated on our traditional ways of governance, our traditional ways of living with one another and working together. And so I think that shows planners and educators kind of a way to really think about how, when we look at supporting individuals, accommodating them, planning for their lives, that we're really thinking about their positionality within the whole community and well-being, not just in one isolated segment of an individual's life, but as it goes outwards into the community. And that fosters the whole community well-being too. Autism awareness for an entire community means something significant for the community, not just the person who's impacted by autism.